Let us dispense at once with the sentimental nonsense that the phenomenon known as Donald Trump represents some sort of ideological uprising. Revolutions, even the most grotesque ones, require ideas. They demand doctrines, manifestos, or at the very least, a coherent delusion about the nature of the state. What we are witnessing instead is something far more banal and far more corrosive: the enthronement of appetite. Trump is not a political thinker. He is not even, in the strict sense, a political actor. He is a personality, an unfiltered id projected onto the public square. His utterances do not cohere because they are not meant to. They are impulses. His contradictions are not strategic. They are organic. He contradicts himself with the ease of a man who has never experienced the burden of intellectual consistency and has never once been penalized for lacking it. This alone should have disqualified him, but herein lies the central pathology. His followers do not seek coherence. They seek recognition. Trump's genius, if we must abuse that word, is his ability to act as a mirror. He does not elevate his audience. He reflects them. He does not ask them to think. He reassures them that thinking is unnecessary, even suspect. In this sense, he is not a leader, but a permission slip. It is fashionable and profoundly lazy to label Trump a fascist. Fascism, for all its crimes, possessed a grimly impressive architecture of ideas: the cult of the state, the myth of rebirth, the subordination of the individual to a totalizing vision. Trump offers nothing of the kind. He does not worship the state. He worships himself. The state, to him, is merely another venue, like a casino or a television studio, where his name can be made to glow larger and louder. What animates Trumpism, then, is not ideology but grievance. It is a politics of wounded vanity. Every speech is a complaint. Every rally a group therapy session in which resentment is validated and ignorance is celebrated as authenticity. The enemy is not a rival doctrine but reality itself: facts, expertise, nuance, and memory. Anything that complicates the narrative of personal victimhood must be denounced as a conspiracy. This is why Trump's relationship with truth is not merely casual but hostile. He does not lie in the traditional sense. Lying presupposes respect for the truth one is distorting. Trump treats truth as an inconvenience. If a statement flatters him, it is true. If it contradicts him, it is fake. This is not cynicism. It is solipsism elevated to a political method. The cult, therefore, is not built on shared beliefs. It is built on shared emotions, chief among them rage and self-pity. Trump's followers do not defend his statements because they believe them. They defend them because attacking Trump feels like an attack on themselves. Loyalty replaces judgment. Identity replaces reason. And once that threshold is crossed, politics becomes a faith, immune to evidence and allergic to doubt. Perhaps the most nauseating spectacle in this entire affair is the parade of supposed moral authorities who have thrown themselves at Trump's feet. Nowhere is this more evident than among the American religious right, a constituency that once claimed, with straight faces, to care about character. These are the same people who spent decades lecturing the nation on virtue, chastity, humility, and the sanctity of family life. Yet they now grovel before a man whose life reads like a satirical checklist of the 7 deadly sins: adultery, flaunted; greed, celebrated; pride, weaponized; dishonesty, elevated to an art form. The hypocrisy here is not incidental, it is structural. What Trump offered these moralists was not redemption but power. And power, it turns out, was what they wanted all along. The pieties were merely branding. Once the transaction was complete, the mask slipped with astonishing speed. This alliance reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of modern belief. Trump did not corrupt these institutions, he exposed them. He demonstrated that their moral outrage had always been selective, their principles negotiable, and their God remarkably tolerant of political expediency. In Trump, they found not a leader but an idle one who demanded nothing of them except obedience. It is tempting to mock this as mere farce, but it is far more dangerous than that. When moral language is emptied of meaning, it becomes a tool of coercion rather than persuasion. Words like patriot, faith, and freedom are reduced to tribal signals, stripped of ethical content. Once that happens, the public discourse collapses into noise. Trump thrives in this environment because he has no moral commitments to betray. He has no intellectual debts to honor. He floats above contradiction because he has never anchored himself to a principle. His critics accuse him of inconsistency, but inconsistency implies a deviation from a standard. Trump has none. What remains then is pure transactional politics. Loyalty is rewarded, dissent is punished, expertise is humiliated. Institutions are treated not as safeguards but as obstacles. The press becomes an enemy, judges become traitors. Elections become valid only when they produce the desired outcome. This is not authoritarianism in the classical sense. It is something cruder and more infantile. It is the tantrum elevated to a governing style. And like all tantrums, it depends on the indulgence of adults who should know better. The most enduring damage of Trumpism will not be measured in legislation or court appointments, but in the corrosion of intellectual standards. A society that rewards ignorance with applause and cruelty with clicks is one that has begun to eat itself. Trump did not invent this decay. He merely exploited it with shameless efficiency. The erosion of attention spans, the monetization of outrage, the conflation of confidence with competence, these trends predate him. But he accelerated them, he normalized them. He made stupidity feel defiant and knowledge feel elitist. This is why Trump's departure from the stage, whenever it occurs, will not mark an end. The conditions that produced him remain. A culture that mistakes volume for substance will always be vulnerable to the loudest charlatan. A public that confuses feeling offended with being oppressed will always seek a champion of its grievances. The antidote to this is not nostalgia, nor is it technocratic condescension. It is the reassertion of intellectual seriousness. Politics must once again be about ideas, about arguments that can be tested, criticized, and improved. This requires courage, because thinking is harder than chanting, and doubt is more demanding than belief. Hitchens used to insist that the essence of free thought was not knowing what to think, but being willing to think. Trumpism represents the abdication of that responsibility. It asks nothing of the mind and flatters every prejudice. It offers the comfort of certainty without the inconvenience of evidence. A cult built on ego cannot survive contact with reality indefinitely, but it can leave scars, it can deform institutions, it can degrade language, and it can teach an entire generation that conviction matters more than truth. The task, then, is not merely to oppose Trump as a figure, but to reject the habits of mind that made him possible. Skepticism must replace loyalty, argument must replace insult, and the courage to say, "I might be wrong," must be reclaimed as a civic virtue. Anything less is surrender. And surrender, as history reminds us, is always more expensive than resistance. If there is a lesson to be salvaged from the age of Trump, it is not a comforting one. It is the brutal realization that no democracy, however wealthy or long-lived, is immune to intellectual atrophy. Systems do not collapse solely from external assault. They decay from within when citizens abandon the discipline of thinking. The remedy, therefore, cannot be charismatic leadership or nostalgic myth-making. It must begin at a far less glamorous level, the restoration of standards. A society must once again insist that claims require evidence, that power demands justification, and that sincerity is no substitute for truth. This is not elitism, it is literacy applied to politics. Education, in its truest sense, must be defended not as job training or ideological conditioning, but as inoculation against demagoguery. The ability to recognize a fallacy, to detect emotional manipulation, and to tolerate complexity is the only reliable defense against those who trade in outrage. Without these skills, voters become audiences, and elections become spectacles. Equally vital is the revival of moral consistency. If character matters, it must matter universally, not selectively. If corruption is intolerable, it cannot become admirable when performed by one's preferred strongman. Hypocrisy is not merely a private vice, it is a public accelerant of cynicism. When citizens learn that principles are negotiable, they stop believing in principles altogether. The media, too, must abandon its addiction to provocation. Coverage driven by clicks rather than clarity does not merely reflect public appetite, it shapes it. To report responsibly is not to sanitize reality, but to refuse to infantilize the audience. Democracy presupposes adults. Treating citizens as children guarantees that they will behave as such. Most importantly, individuals must reclaim the burden of intellectual responsibility. Freedom of speech does not absolve one from the duty to listen, to revise, and to concede error. A culture that celebrates certainty over curiosity will always drift toward authoritarian personalities, even when cloaked in populist rhetoric. Trumpism, stripped of its theatrics, is not a movement of ideas but a confession of exhaustion, a signal that thinking had become too difficult and self-examination too painful. The answer to this fatigue is not silence, nor is it rage. It is the stubborn insistence that truth exists, that arguments matter, and that ego is a disastrous foundation upon which to build a politics. The future will belong either to those willing to do the hard, unglamorous work of reason, or to those who shout the loudest while thinking the least. History offers no third option.